Hello YouTube. Today we're looking at another relatively inexpensive firearm. This is the Kahr Arms uh, MK40. So this is a single stack, subcompact 40 Smith & Wesson 5-round magazine, and nothing in there. I got this gun secondhand, and it was a little beat up when I got it. The magazine follower, I think I have the original still somewhere. You can see the bottom of the follower was all chewed off, where somebody had presumably dropped it or hit it hard enough to shatter that. And there was a bad spring in it that I needed to replace, and I wasn't sure how hard it was going to be to get parts, and so I went on to the Kahr Arms website and was absolutely pleasantly surprised, and that virtually every part of the entire series of guns that they make is available online and at relatively low prices to boot. So there's only one thing about this gun to start with that I know is potentially disastrously tricky, and that, if you notice this mangled pin here, is the trigger pin. The trigger pin, for reasons beyond my ability to explain, is pressed in, and it makes it nearly impossible to remove. I've got some hammering on there. Eventually, I had to get an arbor press to press that pin out, and part of the pin broke in the process. Either way, I ended up trimming it down to be a slightly thinner pin so that I can actually drive it in and out with a hammer. I have no idea why they felt the need to put it in so terrifyingly immobily. But anyway, enough fuss. Let's get into it. So takedown, there are marks for takedown. There's a mark on the lower and the frame, on the upper and on the frame, and so you slide those back till they're in the same, and then you're going to push the takedown pin out from the other side, and it's going to start to move, and then you can just pull it out from this side. And at that point, if you hold the gun in its regular locked up position and pull the trigger, then you'll be able to pull the slide off the frame. So we're going to set the frame aside for now, set the magazine aside, tuck that over there, and get to town. So a double spring recoil spring. This is another piece that I think they may have made just a little bit flimsy. Basically, when it's in the gun, it's fine, but when you're in the takedown position or when you're reassembling it, it's really easy to bend the little back plate. It's not particularly sturdy, so my recommendation is don't leave it out like that for weeks at a time. If you've got it out of the gun, pop the spring out so you don't damage that plate any more than you have to. Again, when it's in the gun, it's got a much larger and flatter surface to sit against. So it doesn't hang on this edge. It actually sits significantly further higher up when it's actually in there. So all right, barrel, just wiggle it out forward. Standard issue for the most part, tipping barrel design. When the gun recoils, this pin acts as the actual lock. So it's going to travel straight back, and then it's going to have to tip down. The same thing on the way forward. It's going to raise up and then lock itself into position. Does have a fairly unusually large hood, and also cutaway a lot. I assume that's just because of the design of their angle of ejection. The other thing that's a little odd is the ramp is also slightly off center. So when they built this, the whole thing, if you look, when the barrel is in there, this whole thing is off to one side. So basically, they just kind of, this block is only half of what it would kind of normally be. Again, just how they designed it gave more clearance for the rest of their parts. And they actually end up with a very almost elegantly simple design on the frame. Either way, it does have a firing pin safety, so a firing pin cannot go all the way forward unless that's pressed. And when this is pressed, that firing pin is free floating, so it is inertial. In other words, the striker spring only takes you so far, and then inertia takes you the rest of the way. And let's see, what else was in here that I had to cope with for disassembly? Right. If I recall, there's no real good way to get this spring back. So if you look in here, you can see a white sleeve in front of the striker. You see the striker, and then you see a black plastic piece with the firing pin spring around it. And basically, the back, way in there, of the black plastic piece is actually what's in the end cap and kind of in our way for what we need to do to take it down. So with a screwdriver, I'm just going to get in here, reach as far back as I can coil-wise, and bring the coils and hopefully the whole spring down with them. And then I should be able to slide that back off. Although there's also a hole for the extractor, and now I'm off the top of my head, I can't remember how critical that is. So let me just try this one first with bringing my coils and black. Alright, based on the fact that I can't get that to move, there is room just to the side of the back plate for you to get in there and push on the back of the ejector, and that's going to get it started. So that's actually step one. Now we can come in here and grab those coils, bring them down, and get that plastic bit just far enough forward to get it out of our way. Oh, I'm having a terrible time grabbing this today. Really? Maybe I was a little overzealous in how far to start that. Let's try that one more time. If I had something exactly the right size to get down there and behind the plastic piece to push it forward, that would be handy. Like, I feel that I missed something when doing this, because I eventually, just get lucky enough to be able to move it. But yeah, and each time I'm grabbing it, I'm just kind of missing just a little bit. So since I'm failing it that way, I'll just do it the two-handed way. Since I am able to get the plastic to move just a little bit, I'll come in here, move it, and then tuck something in behind it. Alright, so now I have something, my punch, that I can use to move that plastic well out of the way and continue with the removal of that. Now, as you probably saw, I just launched that ejector because my thumb wasn't quite over the side of it. So we will be playing a little bit of hunt for the ejector here. I heard it hit the camera. Oh, that's a great start to the day. There it is. So let's try and get some more of these bits out here. Without the spring tension, the extractor is starting to flop around a little bit for us, and so hopefully we can just kind of tap that out. And I'm going to try and push these guys out from that end. There's the spring, and there's the other piece. So our ejector system here consists of this setup, and just all goes in that same order. The extractor itself is nice and fat, so it's going to get a good hold on the gun. It's also it looks angled, but it's really not, because the actual cut in the slide is at an angle. So it's fairly straight. It's not perfectly straight. It's angled a little bit to aid with chambering, or catching the rim as it comes up anyway. But it is a nice large extractor surface, but that also means it's not going to drop straight out the left side of the gun. You do have to rotate it out, and likewise you can't just drop it in from the side because it's wider. So I've got to hook that under when you're putting it in. Alright, so Let's go ahead and slide that ejection system over. Now, as I was flipping it upside down, I also knocked out a couple other parts. And let's get them all out at once, and then we can reassemble it so you can see what's going on in here. Oh, perfect. There we go. So that's how all this was sitting in there. So the striker has got more than one piece, so not an uncommon setup to have a plastic, back piece in the gun that gets compressed enough so that it's always partially in there. But what's odd about this one is this piece, the front part. I think it's just how they chose to machine it. It was easier to make separate parts and make this machining a little more straightforward than to actually, mill something that deep. But the end result is that this piece just slides into the striker, and the little Lego-like nipple on the back is going to actually hold that spring in place as well. And if we flip around to think about how it engages with the, if I hold everything right side up, this will be better. With the firing pin safety, I think we can see where this actually catches. Yeah, it's designed to catch on this bottom rim here, that little edge there. It's just going to catch on the side of the striker as if it were coming forward. So when something pushes this up, the striker can move freely in that big space, but when this is all the way up under its own pressure, it's going to block the striker from coming any further forward on that little ridge. So that's your firing pin safety, your striker, and I didn't look up the name of this particular piece. As far as I can tell, it's symmetrical, so it doesn't really matter top, bottom, left, or right. As long as the back piece is pointed the right way, it'll line up with the spring, and that's the whole assembly going in. And that's all there is to it. Again, this hole, not for putting oil in, that is a brass shavings exhaust port. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking the hole in their striker fired gun is for lubrication, and it never is. These are designed to be run with a absolute minimum of lubrication and none at all in the firing pin chamber. You'll notice that all of these surfaces have a fairly hefty finish on them. So to get it all back together, it's really a matter of just lining up the shapes correctly. He said after turning it the wrong way twice. Just wanted to make sure that the spring was not going to fall out on me. And then this one, I push that firing pin safety down to get it past there. When we talk about our ejector, we're just going to build it up the reverse order. So that one I'm going to drop in there first, because the piece that goes in next has that slanted front, cat hair. We want that to, match up to the curve at the back of the extractor. So drop that in there, and hopefully, well, once it's under a little spring tension anyway, it should all start to line up. Yeah, and then I can see it's turned itself around for us, and we're ready to try and get everything put back together. So this is going to be a little bit tricky, because we have to get this guy started in there, and we're also going to have to compress that in the extractor plunger fairly hard and fairly far. So I believe the first one that we have to overcome is, in fact, the firing pin spring. So to do that, you basically push it in until it's lined up with the striker channel itself, at which point it's going to bring itself in. and not wiggle around so much left to right. Now I think at this point that it will hold on the edge. So as long as it doesn't drop below there and we don't let up on this, it's going to hold position. And now we can use a punch to move the organization to push in the plunger of the extractor, which lets us get to that next position. And again, I'm just doing a little check to make sure that I'm not binding anything and that the plastic isn't caught up between two other bits, and everything looks fine. So pop it up and look, and sure enough, the plastic circle is now embedded in the back plate. We can see through the little hole the edge of the extractor plunger. So we should be able to feel that we have extractor tension. I hope I got that straight enough. It certainly doesn't feel like as much tension as I would like. Let me double check this here. Oh yeah, now it's wiggled itself into position. And again, firing striker should not be able to come all the way forward until we firing pin safety. Then we have protrusion, and we should have spring tension on the striker itself. So that's the upper. Nothing else particularly mystical or magical about it. We know something in the frame is going to push that up at the time of firing, and something else in the frame is got the job of pulling back on the sear. The sear looks a little bit chewed up, or the striker tail anyway. Probably would not hurt to check that a little bit carefully, or maybe even replace it. Doesn't look, based on the wear pattern, I'm not sure how well you can see that there's slightly different color along the edge, but it's not super even and it's not super thick. Usually you should get, enough engagement there that you know that it's not in an unsafe scenario. So I would actually check on both the sear side and the striker side to see how that wear pattern is going, and decide if I want to actually put a new striker or sear or both in there. Like I said, the parts are nice and cheap at kahrarms.com. So the frame. I'll take the hand guards off. Just gonna put them around the corner for a second. Now, when you do take the right side handguard off, the trigger return spring, or not trigger return spring, but the trigger lift spring, trigger bar spring is in a little bit of a precarious spot with the handguards off. If you operate the trigger a whole bunch, it will pop off. So you kind of want to make sure, and that's this curly Q spring I'm talking about. Normally, if there's something like the side of the gun on its way here, that keeps it from flopping around too much, and its whole job is to just provide upward pressure so that the disconnect stroke has a return. The actual trigger return is inside there, and that's really it for that one. Let's see. Oh, it has a 1911 style magazine release, so you push the magazine release most of the way in, and you use a small screwdriver, and you just gently manipulate how far in you're pushing the magazine release. In this case, it's pretty much all the way to flush on the far side, and at that point you'll be able to turn this counterclockwise about a quarter turn, and then the whole thing will pop out. And if you haven't had 1911s, what's happening there is this mechanism. There's a spring and a screw head with a little side extension, and that side extension, when the gun is in the frame, is what holds the whole thing in. When you're taking it out, you basically are tucking it so that it's hidden inside the barrel of or the body rather of the mag release. Inside the frame itself is a little groove, so that when you put it back in and you rotate this, this gets stuck in that groove and becomes non-moving, and then the button is being pushed in and out from the other side. So that's kind of a neat little mechanism, because while it's out of the gun, once it's cleaned and everything, you can just assemble the whole thing and have it, you know, be in a position where it can drop right into place, and you don't have to worry about the fact that it's 3 parts. So pop that guy out, and we are going to take this the trigger set out, but I wanted to show you a couple things on the way here. First, this spring hooks under the trigger bar and has just a little U-shaped hook under there. Butterfingers today. There we go. So that pops out. There. I think my spring is a little bit deformed as well, so I did just order a new one. It sits in this little cutout in the frame. So if you can see, basically right along there, it's just a little groove, and it even goes into the back a bit there. Spring essentially tucks in there and sits in that groove. Fat fingers. So that's the idea for the base of the spring, and then you hook it the rest of the way under. Now I have a theory that, again, I haven't seen a brand new one to know for sure, that this spring feels to me like it really wants to be hooked all the way behind this part of the trigger bar where there's a little notch. The problem is once you get that far, or at least a problem with this particular spring I have, is that if I actually push it back far enough to engage in that notch, everything, it goes cattywampus. The spring comes up. It feels like it's under way too much pressure, and it just doesn't work. But that notch is there, so it makes me wonder if my spring isn't actually deformed. So pay attention to what your spring looks like when you take it out. Again, popping it off from the inside a little bit easier. And you won't be able to take the trigger bar out just yet. You will be able to get it far enough out of our way to do the next step, however, which is to take a small punch, and the sear pin will come out. Now the sear pin goes through the actual, let's tuck it back in here, the sear itself and the ejector. And there's a spring, and the spring is actually between these two pieces, and it lives in a cavity in the ejector itself. So it's a really novel design. It's an odd type of compression spring. It's the same kind of mechanism as on the burst cam on an M16, but you'll see it when we get out there. But essentially, the pin is holding two pieces, and then in between them, where you can't see, inside the extractor is a little coil of spring. We're going to try and take them out as a bit of a unit, but it's probably going to just fall all over the place. This pin, under very little tension, you should not need a hammer. It just slides in and out once it's lined up. And now here you can see the ejector and its friend coming away. And I'm going to pull this out. And there we go. There's the whole mechanism. Now, I'm going to try and line them back up before I go for the spring itself. Did I already miss? I may have already missed. Alright, I already missed. Alright, so this is what I was talking about. If you see on the sear system, tiny hole. And on the ejector, a cavity with another tiny hole, and this funky spring. So this is a coil of spring, same diameter as the hole that it's going into, and it has legs on either side, ever so slightly offset. And the way that works is that you pop it into the hole, and you make sure one of those tiny legs goes through the tiny hole in the ejector itself. My old eyes make it not so easy to line that up. Come on. So tiny. There we go. So now leg pokes out just the tiniest bit, and the other end, a little bit of cat fur. So when they're going together, the tiny hole in the sear itself rather, goes like that. And once that's lined up, the pin holds them steady together. I'm going to try and get the pin through at the same time with the whole thing outside, just so we can experience that firsthand, because it gives you a sense of what you're trying to do once it's in the gun itself. And of course, like the rockets surgeon that I am, I've lost track of where the tiny hole is. There we go. So once in the gun, what that creates is a situation where if something tilts that spring it's being worked against, and it's going to provide a counter force to bring it back to that neutral position along the axis of the pin. So the ejector, it's got this little tail that hooks into the frame, and so these pieces can't really move too much. The ejector can't, but the sear, anything that grabs it from the back will pull it backwards, and it's going to pop itself back forwards afterwards. So that's a pretty nifty little mechanism. I'm going to leave that as an assembly for now. And now here's where I'm just going to give you a solid piece of advice that you should really listen to. Notice how mangled this is. It's because I'm not afraid to hit things with a hammer when I own them. If you hit this a couple times and it is not moving, stop. Find someone who's got a press, who can get a nice clean push on it and push it straight through. It is wide. It had a wide side on this. This is not what yours would look like. This is banged up because it's actually broken. Originally, somewhere it was lying around the bench a minute ago. Yeah, here we go. Originally, the far side of that pin looked like that. That little piece of metal was actually the cap end of the pin, and it was perfectly flush with the side. So that they actually, I think when they press it in, they do this. They basically make the end of the pin flat, and it is a chamfered hole as well. So this pin gets driven in from this side in a press and flattens a little bit in the process, leaving it perfectly flat against the side of the gun, but making it next to impossible to drive out. So when driving it out, that's the other important thing. The big side obviously goes out towards the big side, which is the left side of the gun. Now this one, because I've played with it, I will be able to hammer it back out with just a bit of grunt work here. So I'm going to slide it over here and wail on it for just a second. Just the punch. Yeah, this isn't the one. Where's the hammer? So what I did when I finally broke this guy free, I went on to kahrarms.com and ordered 2 more. And B, I popped it in the Dremel tool with some super 600 grit sandpaper and just began to reduce the diameter ever so slightly. And then I would try and drive it back into the hole until it still took a hammer to make it move, but no longer an actual arbor press to make it move. So again, unless you have to do this step, you can just not do it at all and accept that there's only so far you can go with this particular firearm. or get it pressed out. And if you want to be able to take it out and put it in multiple times, you're probably going to have to do something to reduce the width of it. Or maybe I just got really unlucky and mine was oversized. So now when I pull this punch out, the reason I left it in after driving through was there's a couple different things going on in here. The trigger itself has a spot that the trigger bar is hung into, and then there's a plastic piece and then a large coil, which is the trigger return spring, and the coil goes around the plastic piece, and then the pin goes through the trigger and the plastic piece. So once I pull the pin out, nothing else is really going to hang onto that coil, and it's kind of going to go drifting out. It's not going to launch out in this case, but I'm going to try and see which direction it's going to poke itself out in. There we go. So I poked it out through the bottom, and that's the two pieces we're talking about. And at this point, the trigger bar and trigger will just come out. So I'm going to show how all that was situated in the firearm frame. So the trigger bar sat in this little hole. It's got a little nub, and it just sits in there, and the only thing that keeps it from falling out is a little plastic retainer. And that plastic retainer has a flat side, which goes on the bottom to match the trigger itself. Oh, fat finger down. There we go. There. So the flat side of the plastic sleeve, for lack of a better word, the pin is going to go through that. Where did I put the pin? Now the pin is not tight at all through the trigger or through the plastic sleeve. There's plenty of free space for it to rotate there. But as you look at the trigger bar doesn't really come up super far, but no matter how far it goes, the plastic is now holding it against the trigger. So even though that engagement there is really small, it's only as thick as, this piece of metal itself, it can't fall out. It can't move left or right to pop out of that hole. So once the pin is in there holding the plastic in there, the plastic holds the trigger bar, and that's the whole story. The trigger return spring goes around that plastic bushing, and is pretty straightforward. When it's in there, it's going to be wanting to push against the frame and the underside of the trigger to bring it into the forward position. When you pull the trigger, you're going to be compressing this spring like that, and so it's going to want to spring back forward, bringing the trigger with it. So if we want to look at how does the gun actually fire, let's just keep in mind what's going to happen when we pull the trigger, which is the trigger bar is going to move forward. So trigger bar is coming forward when we pull the trigger. So that's all we have to really understand, is that when this trigger is pulled, it creates forward motion on the trigger bar. So if we take our sear system, and hopefully the spring is still together, and it is, yay! We're going to picture how this all sits in the gun, and that's basically like, it's hard to line up. It sits there like that. This groove here is what the trigger bar sits in, and so when you pull the trigger, you're doing two things. This is your sear, so this is what's grabbing on to the back of the striker, and it's going to be coming back and therefore also down. Now once it goes far enough down, it'll be dropping the striker. So it's kind of that whole double action thing. As you're first pulling the trigger, you are pulling the striker just a little bit further back, but very quickly you're going to drop off it. But at the same time, this big lump is coming up, and that's going to operate the firing pin safety itself. So as you're pulling the trigger, you're both cocking it a little bit more, engaging the firing pin safety, and then this will come down low enough to release the sear, and bang goes the gun. After that, the disconnect has to happen so that it's not an automatic pistol, which means something has got to move this bar off of the sear so it can reset. So it's going to have been pulled to there, and it's this bump at the top that does that. This intrudes into the rail system. So when the gun cycles, the rails, the slide itself will push this down and off the back of the sear. So once it drops off the back of the sear is free to bounce back to its normal position and catch that striker again. That's it. Process repeats. When you then let go of it, this moves all the way to the back, snaps up, and gets right behind there, ready to pull the trigger for you again. So as we were just saying, where does this sit when that happens in the frame? Trigger bar's in there, and as you can see, it's right in the rails there, and so when the gun cycles, it's going to push that down and out of the way, and that's what creates your disconnect. That's going to push it just far enough to drop off the sear. The curly spring here will push it back up once you've let go of the trigger, and that gives you your reset. So very straightforward, traditional trigger bar, fairly sturdy. The original one I got was actually slightly different, and I went ahead and replaced it just because, as you can see on the nice new one, this curve is perfect, and it's an actual, perfect curve. Whereas this one, if the light's right, you can tell there's a flat here and a flat here where the slide has done its work and bumped into it enough times that it's slightly deformed it. Was this enough to make it not function at all? No, I could easily have smoothed that over, and it didn't lose so much height that it wasn't going to disconnect. You'd have to wear it down a good ways for that to be an issue. I just figured that aesthetically, since I was buying parts anyway, I might as well buy a new one of those. So, the last piece in there, I can't remember if I took this out before or not. There's a little Torx screw here. Let's see if I get... Oh, I guessed wrong. It's smaller than that. It's smaller than that. Apparently I'm not so good at the guessing today. Third time's the charm. Yay. Alright, so I put these other ones away real quick. Magic number, Torx 8. It looks like the right size for that. And that's just the spring that serves two purposes in its life. One is it's the retention for the main pin. As this pin goes in, you're compressing this spring a little bit. And if you can tell, there's a notch at the back of that pin, and that's what that spring pops into. That makes sure this doesn't drift out. So it just provides a little extra tension. As a general rule, the back bump on it here is enough. It's going to be on the inside of the slide, so it's not generally in a position to move. That's just one extra tensioning mechanism. Now the other piece, though, the clever bit, as it were, is you'll notice that the spring intrudes into this area just a little bit. And if you look at the slide lock, it's got some pretty wacky geometry going on here. So several different functional things happening at once. This part here is just designed to get on the inside of the slide so that it can't come out. It serves the same purpose as the groove here. It's just a retention mechanism so this doesn't drift out of the gun. On the underside, the magazine is going to come up and lift up on this on the last round. So wherever that mag went. The magazine is in there. You can tell that the underside of this piece is going to be what's lifted up by this metal piece in the magazine there. So in the magazine, the actual shelf, they put some metal reinforcing in there so it doesn't wear as much. Now, we saw also that it made, the previous owner ended up cracking it somehow, but I have seen a lot of polymer mags have this as a problem, that the mags wear out at that point where they engage the metal of the slide lock. So that's actually a nice design improvement. But then the last bit here is that it's supposed to be a spring-loaded thing, which means that if you're not lifting it up with your thumb, or the magazine isn't lifting it up, then it needs to pull itself down. And the way that is accomplished, was I holding that off the whole time? Yeah, I can see it. All right, is this shelf here. Basically, when you go to put it into the gun, this little tiny leg of the spring in the frame will ride up this tiny shelf and sit right there. So it's important when you're pushing this in and reassembling, when you get to that point, that you don't just shove it in there willy-nilly, that you have to make sure this is in its all the way down position before you get any further in than this. And the idea here is you should be able to see that leg of the spring, and you should see that it's going to engage that on the ramped part of the surface, so that it will ride up the ramp and sit there, where it acts as a spring to bring this back down every time you push it up. So that's what all those crazy geometry cuts in that piece of metal are. They're all there for some kind of reasons. So there you go. Now, for some reason, if you break this, this is a part that they do sell online. Hopefully, it's not, yeah, this is not permanently attached with Loctite or anything. And so if you do need to replace it, it comes right off. And it does have a curve in the spring at the base, where there's a tiny, tiny hole in the frame. So when we were looking at the piece, it looked more or less flat, because it looked like that. But if we turn it to the side, we see that it actually has that piece which intrudes into this tiny, tiny hole right down in the corner there. And so when you're putting the spring back in, make sure you get that piece into its hole. And once that's tucked into its hole, then the screw will retain it the rest of the way. My phone is ringing. I'm going to see who's on the phone. Hello? Hello? She's not available right now. Can I take a message? Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't have time right now. Please take our number off your list. Oh, really interrupting me to ask for money for... Kumbaya. All right. I apologize for the interruption, but cyber begging's not good enough. They still do it old school. All right, so reassembly of this bad boy is a little bit tricky on a couple points. Mainly that, let's see, remember when you put the trigger itself in, it has to come up from the bottom. There's not actually room for it to come out the top. There's the locking system is kind of in the way. And then, which means you've got to put this in after the fact. So as we go to get our trigger bar in, you have to kind of tuck it in from the side and find its way to the matching hole. Come on. So close. Come to Papa. Come to Papa Smurf. You know, it's going to come out so many times, I'm not sure why it's that important. All right, so once it's in there, as long as you keep a finger over here so that it doesn't flop out, and don't lift it up too high, it'll actually stay in there. By the S in the frame, there's actually not a whole lot of room for it to move left and right, so we use that to aid us in reassembly. So you'll see me struggle to keep a finger on that piece as we do the rest of it. Now, the next bit is going to involve a pair of pliers and some mild cursing in all likelihood, because I could find no reliable, clever, or easy way to always make this line up. So you can tell which side is the right side here, because we know that the large part of the flat circle is actually holding the trigger bar, so that goes to the right side of the gun. The flat part matches the flat cut at the bottom where it touches the trigger. And then if you look at this spring, one end is ever so slightly bent up and the other end is perfectly straight. The ever so slightly bent up end is the front, or at least it was when I got it, and it seems to be easiest to install that way. The trick is getting it into place now and then getting something through it to hold it in there long enough to actually get the pin in. And I found, well, at least in the middle of the night last night when I was beating on this, what I found was that actually trying to come up from the bottom to get it in place seemed to work the best. So again, keeping track of where the flat part is, trying to keep the spring oriented, we're going to try and get this underneath the trigger and slid up into place. Which, of course, part of that challenge is getting it through the trigger bar itself, and then trying to get it to line up. And I'm looking for my smallest punch, which I think I moved over here. Now, I missed pretty heinously here. Let's see if it's recoverable at all. Maybe. So again, just kind of holding it all there, and see if I can't coax that plastic down into position gently. And I think the answer is no. So again, just knocking that back out and trying again. This took me a few tries. So if there's some magic to this, if somebody out there comes up with a, hey, this was really easy because I did X, for the love of God, post it in a comment for the rest of us. Because in my experience, there wasn't a whole lot that was going to make this easier. Now, one thing I did do at one point was I went ahead and started a punch, a thinner punch. Started a punch through it to hold the trigger itself in place, and then I dropped the trigger bar. And the comedy ensues. Alright, so let's try this again. I don't need to have this punch nearly that far through, so I'm just going to try that a little more gently. Okay, so now our trigger bar is back in place, and get a finger on that. I'm going to pull my screwdriver, or pull my punch out so that it's only holding the into one side of the trigger, just barely at that. And I'm going to get this piece started. I did a little better that time. Yeah, we're going to be able to work with this one, I think. So, again, getting in here with a punch. Because we got to hang on to as many of the pieces as we can. What I'm trying to do is get through the punch. I'm not going to be able to get all the way through. What I've managed to hook right now is I've missed the actual plastic sleeve, but I have gotten it through the springs, which is fine. That's enough to hold it in place. And now I can come in here. I'm going to try and throw a little bit more light on this. See how the plastic flat side is way at the wrong angle? That's supposed to be down against the top of the underside of the trigger there. So I'm going to try and rotate that down a little bit into place. Since there's not a whole lot of tension on it right now, it's never going to be easier to move. Be careful not to lose the whole thing again. Since we're having 3 or 4 arms is often a benefit. Alright, so what I have now is I have an undersized punch, but it is going all the way through it. So now I can manipulate the plastic sleeve so it's on the right side. Once we put the right size pin through it, that plastic sleeve will bottom out and stop rotating. So basically I'm just trying to manually, without monkeying out the plastic itself, try and just to coax that into position. And checking it from the bottom. Come on. Work with me here. Alright, so that's RDC, real darn close. So what I'm going to do now is, since our punch goes in from this side to that side, I'm going to start it, but be very careful to start the pin, but I'm going to keep the punch in there pretty well, because we got to guide this thing in one little step at a time, and it's not going to want to go easily. So we have the ability to manipulate, the plastic piece, the spring itself, and both legs of the spring. So that's what you're kind of working on, is to see, has the pin gone far enough in to engage the trigger at all? And I think the answer is not quite yet. So tappa, 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 and make sure your trigger is still moving around. Try not to lose it with the punch. Oh, yeah. We're still good. Just haven't made it all the way yet. There we go. So now it's starting to bind up a little bit, because I've got it far enough to kind of start to interfere with the trigger, which means, once I wiggle it just right, the trigger itself is now ever so slightly seated onto the pin. So that means I can give it another couple decent taps to move it through there. And now I've got a good grasp on the trigger itself. Now, at one point during an assembly attempt, I actually did that before I tried to get the other stuff lined up. I don't really think it worked better, just differently. And the other thing that I've got going on now that I didn't have last time, I think is going to be a disadvantage, is that this is a much smaller punch that I've got as a reference punch holding it in. I think it's going to be a little harder to line up my plastic piece because of it. So I should have swapped out a slightly larger punch before I went for this, but I'm going to try it, because no guts, no glory. So I'm going to try and use that punch to bring it down as much as possible, tap it through a little bit more, and see if I'm able to catch it. And I definitely haven't caught it yet. So all right. So the short and ugly answer is there's not going to be a good way to keep that in place while swapping it out for the better sized punch. So I'm just going to try and do that with the screwdriver. and pray for the best. And I got lucky. So I was able to hold it in place so that it didn't pop out just long enough to get a little bit bigger punch in there. It's going to be closer to the final size. And see if... Alright, so we definitely, or at least impacting on the plastic. We don't want to hit it too far so we deform it or anything. But we're getting there. Nice. So the advantage of all that is the minute it's in the plastic, then nothing can really screw it up from that point on. The coil has lots of room around that plastic to move. So the big spring, it's not like having a tight spring really close in diameter, that coil. This one is a little friendlier. So now that I've got that, I can really just drive this through. And I'm not going to meet any kind of unexpected strange resistance because the trigger itself, you know, since it's solid and on both sides and already through the pin, it's going to be aligned. And I don't have to hold any of the rest of the parts in once that's caught even just a little. And so now remember that I'm waiting for a proper pin because this one's so chewed up and mangled, so it won't come as flush as the other one. But we now have a trigger bar that does its little job and flops around like it's supposed to. So now I guess we want to get our sear system in there. Now, once again, I'm going to go ahead and take this apart and set it all up from scratch one more time, just in case you're skipping around in the video and have all these parts in a pile. We start with the ejector and the little spring itself. Now, in the ejector at the bottom is a little hole. This spring is a coil with a small turn on 90-degree out on each side. So if you grab it by one of those and look at the hole, you should be able to guesstimate your way to lining it up pretty well, and it'll sit in there and ever so slightly protrude out the back, just a little bit. You can see it against my thumbnail. And then the sear itself, no hole on that side because it's backwards. There's the hole, and you just want to line that up so that it goes into the tiny hole in the sear. Now, exactly where these guys end up sitting is not terribly important. You just kind of want them together long enough for you to get them positioned in the frame, because there's just not a lot of room to maneuver in here. So I'm going to try and just, with the one sitting atop the other, just try and get them started towards their final destination. Apparently I'm going to fail pretty miserably at it. Alright. That's okay. We've done weirder things and narrower spots before. Oh. Okay. Did that actually work? Ejector's rather sharp, so I think it did. We got to line up the holes without, you can't, with just the spring in there and not the pin for it to rotate around, you really can't tell what's what. So it's not until you can actually look through the hole here and start to move things around that you can get a sense of, you know, how close it is to lined up. So again, looking through that hole, and yeah, that's going to work pretty well. All right, so once you get a punch through it, you know you're relatively close. Well, in my case, it just slipped right through. You may have to wiggle it as you go. But now the whole thing is essentially together. So as long as you hang on to that pin and use your finger to keep this up, then we should see sear come back and down, firing pin safety go up. And then the disconnect is just when that drops down. So that lets the sear reset. And once again, I'm keeping my finger over this pin on the other side, because until the side panel is on, that can fall out. It's got a little bit of the spring tension from the sear, just not a ton. So we can kind of leave it. But anyway, this spring, little tricky. Like I said, I'm not 100% sure if mine is a little bit malformed or not, but there is a groove for you to set it in and then hook it under a firing pin. And as I said at the beginning of the video, if you're going to manipulate it with the side off, make sure you keep a finger there to keep it from flopping around too much. And the other thing I mentioned is that I do have a theory that mine is deformed, and it may actually be supposed to hook as far back as there. But if you noticed how far my spring stands up when I do that, that worries me, especially because if I just kind of put my finger to keep it from completely popping off, if I let that go as it comes back, it's not rotating, it's not staying down in its slot. The coil wants to come up where it's going to bump into the thing and interfere with it. So either this is how it's supposed to be, and it does just drag along the bottom of it a little bit, and that little cut there is an optical illusion, or conceivably I could have the whole spring in backwards. But I don't think so, because the hole in the frame where the tail of the spring looks like it should go, back here, it's not wide enough for the coil. So if the coil were supposed to be nestled back there and the spring were the other way around, because I mean technically the spring's going to work from either side, it's just whether it intrudes into the magazine well or not. So I'm pretty sure this is right. It just feels like it might be a little bit out of shape. So anyway, it's not going to go anywhere once the side well is on, or the side panel. Oh, magazine release, almost forgot. Again, that just drops through, and pushing it to where it's flush on the far side, and then just gently starting to turn it clockwise. You got to be careful, because if it binds and you're not actually in the channel in the frame, it's going to stop. So don't ever force this. Just gently maneuver it, and when it lines up, it'll pop right in there, and you have spring again. So everything else, there's no magazine safety, so there's no other craziness going on with this gun. It's really a nice, simple design. So we'll put this side panel on, which will let us stop worrying about the spring. Oops. Can't screw in a flat screw with a Torx screwdriver. And again, grip screws, don't over tighten them. A 4-pack of screws was like $2. I ordered nice shiny new screws from Kahr too. Better off to lose an occasional side panel screw than to over tighten one to the point of now you've stripped your frame, and no screws will ever help you. So now, as I mentioned before, I wasn't leaving this spring in under tension, so And you can see that it is, pretty banged up. The other thing that's a little bit odd, I don't know exactly what went wrong when they were doing this, but if this spring is perfectly straight back there, like it is when everything's in battery and on the gun, the spring is fine. It's going to poke through there and do its job. But when you're trying to get it seated over the barrel, it's easy for it to be off kilter like that, where I can see one coil of the actual spring, and that's going to keep it from compressing at all, so it's going to make it hard to get in there. So if you're trying to get this spring in and you're having issues, just go easy at it. Slow down, make sure the plastic is coming through. If it feels like my spring doesn't compress at all, that's what's actually happening, is that you're not actually pushing. You're pushing on the plastic, which can't go backwards. So when this spring compresses, the plastic goes with it. It's only the coils of the spring that are held in by the front of the gun. So when you're trying to slide this on, if that's not lined up and you push, it's not going to go anywhere, because you're actually pushing against the plastic itself. And the other thing to remember is that the whole darn thing is off center. So if you don't try and line this up with the center of the lug, remember that the lug is not all the way there. The lug is shy on this left side. However, we're looking at it right side of the gun. So again, there we go. Once it's popped in there, it's not a curved, or is it? Did they give us a curved cutout here, or did they give us a straightaway? Yeah, it's a straight chunk of metal too, which is, another thing. It doesn't have an area that it snaps into. But again, all that's not important, because as soon as we put this on, this is no longer leaning against the barrel. It's intercepted by the frame. So all of what you do there is just to line it up long enough to put the gun back together. So as we put this on, we've got the trick to remember that when the marks line up, that's when it's time to put the pin in, because it means that's when the barrel will be lined up. However, if you just line the marks up and you're not paying attention to anything else, you're going to have a problem on your hands. Because if we look through the hole, I'm not sure how much of this you can see, at this point we're actually looking through the barrel lug. And if I have my finger in front of the barrel when I do this, and I'm moving the barrel back, even when I'm at the right point according to the lineup marks, I'm not at the right point in the lugs. So what I'm trying to tell you here is, it's okay to start this and put it halfway in, then line it up, because halfway in is enough to engage the barrel lug to stop the barrel. So now the barrel stops coming back because you've caught it on the lug. And then the other thing to remember is, before we push this all the way in, yes, it will be lined up with this half moon when these two notches are lined up, but we'd also want to make sure that it's as low down as possible so that we get under the spring. If we put it in, at its highest possible position, we're going to run into the side and mangle our spring. So again, you want this one to be low enough to make sure that you're going to catch that spring. Bring it back to line up the marks. And whoops, that's too low. Oh, I failed. And the way we can test to see if we did that right is if we bring it all the way to the lock position, it should still snap down. That's how we know we caught the spring correctly. It should also lock back on the last round, so it locks back on the empty chamber and all that good stuff. So we pull the trigger and we feel it drop the sear. As we rack it, you got just enough real estate between the frame and slide there to see that it's going to push that disconnector down, and you hear it click, and we come back, and as we let up and go forward, that will pop back into place as it gets behind the sear, and now it's behind the sear, ready to pull the sear forward, or the sear mechanism, pull the underside forward so the sear goes backwards and drop. So reset, bang. So it's a long reset and all that good stuff. Again, it's not a competition style pistol. It's just a nice simple striker fired design, and for the price point, I really can't say anything bad about it. The only true mystery I've got is that spring feels a little weird and how it's holding onto the trigger bar, which could be because mine could be misformed. And then the other was why this pin was not just a nice, easy to use pin. Why? I don't know why. So I will leave that to them. I wasn't the first person to try and get that pin out either. When I got it, it was pretty well rusted, which is always disappointing because stainless steel doesn't rust like metal. But if you've left stainless steel cutlery in the sink too long, you know, you get those galvanic stains on it. So this one had a lot of finger schmoo because the slide cuts here are fairly sharp. And in any gun where that's true, if you don't clean them out between uses, you know, it's pulling a few skin cells off each time and some dust and some grit, and it builds up in there. And so if you have guns that have these sharp cuts, every so often when you're cleaning, you know, grab your handy dandy hobby knife and just run it along that and see what you pick up. You'll usually find there's a lot more schmoo there than you would like. And if you do leave it there too long, then even on a stainless steel gun, it will leave marks behind that look like little pieces of rust. And I have found no way to get them off, short of, you know, refinishing the gun. Anyway, Kahr Arms MK40. Hope you had fun. Stay safe.